It's very good to see you today, to be out and to be. We have guests who are with us, and we're glad that you have decided to make your way into this assembly today. Today, our minds may be kind of thinking about mothers, and that's a very biblical topic, and we'd like to talk about a mother that we find in the Bible. That mother's name is Hannah. And so it probably made my daughter a little nervous when she saw that I was going to preach about Hannah, but don't worry, not her. But instead, Hannah that we read about back in 1 Samuel chapters 1 and 2. Now, as you read about that story, there was a man, and I'm going to relate it carefully, then we're going to go back and read some of the scriptures, but there was a man named Elkanah. And in those days, there was polygamy that was practiced, and he had more than one wife. He had a wife by the name of Peninnah, and he had a wife by the name of Hannah. And as we read about that, we see that Peninnah was very fertile, but Hannah could not have children. It says, in fact, the Lord had closed her womb. And as you read on down through this story, it grieved Hannah a great deal. And in fact, there was a conflict between Peninnah and Hannah over that. But we see that the husband, Elkanah, he very dearly cared for Hannah, and in fact showed her preferential treatment. And Hannah and Peninnah and Elkanah would go up to Shiloh to worship each year. And when they did that, as always, Hannah would pray for a child. And she, in fact, wept so desperately one day that Eli, the priest, thought that she had been drinking. She was so emotional. And in fact, she says no, but she wanted a child so bad. And she made a vow to God that if God would give her a son, that she would give him back to the Lord. And God gave him a son, Samuel. And in that child that she promised to give back to the Lord, when she had weaned him, she did just that. She gave Samuel back to the Lord. And we read that as a young man, Samuel wore the linen ephod of the priest, and he served in the temple of God. Let's talk about some lessons we might be able to learn about Hannah. If you're thinking, oh, it's just for those mothers or just for those women, don't get focused on that, because we'll try to tie some things together for all of us as we talk about this godly mother, Hannah, and her son, Samuel. Would you consider with me that Hannah prepared herself before she was a mother to be a godly mother? We read there in a couple of the passages that I talked about when I was relating that story that's found in 1 Samuel chapters 1 and 2. It says, "So it was year by year when she went up to the house of the Lord that she provoked her. Therefore she wept and did not eat." Peninnah provoked Hannah, and she got upset about that. But I want you to notice something. Hannah, year by year, with her husband, went up to worship. In those days, there were certain offerings that need to be made on a yearly basis. And when it was time to worship, Hannah was there. Hannah, before she ever had a child, wanted to make sure that she was living and serving God in a godly way. That she was being the kind of person that someday could raise up a child in the Lord's way. And so as we think about that, we'll look at a couple of other passages. We think about young ladies who are here who may not have children yet. You can start preparing to be a good mother by the way in which you live right now. By being faithful in your attendance each week. By giving yourself to God in the worship of Him and appreciating who God is. Offering up spiritual sacrifices to God. Living a life of devotion to Him. We see that in the life of Hannah, and we would encourage that as well. We see there that when she did have sorrow in her life in 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 10, how did she respond? She was, it says here, in bitterness of soul. She was so desperately troubled that she hadn't have a child. Well, how did a person like Hannah prepare herself to be a mother? When trials came upon her life, she was a woman who was given to prayer. If you'd like to prepare yourself to be a good mother, if you'd like to be a better mother, or young men, if you'd like to find a woman who will raise up your children in God's way, find a woman who wants to worship, and find a woman who knows how to pray to God. Here we see that in those trials that she faced, she prepared to be a godly mother by praying to the Lord during that time in which she was in anguish. When we look there in 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 18, Hannah said these words, "Let your maidservant find favor in your sight." So the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. What's happened here is Eli's announced to her, guess what? You're going to have a son. She's not been back home. She's not had any relations with her husband. She's not expecting. But she's been told by the priest of God, you're going to have a child. One way in which Hannah prepared herself is she was a woman who believed God. She believed what God said. She believed His word as was delivered by the priest Eli. And we see something very special about Hannah. She was in anguish. She was in sorrow. And the word is given that she's going to have a child. No more sorrow. No more sadness. She was happy because she believed what God said. Oh, what a great example of a mother that is. That we see that she was a person who worshiped. She was a person who prayed. She was a person who believed God. And that prepared her to be the kind of mom that she needed to be. You know, we read about Timothy in the New Testament, and we read about something similar about him. When I decided to talk about Hannah, I could have talked for a little bit about Lois and Eunice. Just one verse, but I could have talked about that for a little while. And we read there that Paul says of the faith that he knows is in Timothy, that he says, when I call to remembrance that genuine faith that is in you, which dwelt first in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I'm persuaded is in you also. When I read about Hannah, I think what she must have instilled in those very, very young years in Samuel. What she must have been able to give to him. And as she would visit him year by year, and part of that story I didn't say is she did visit him year by year. And she took him a little robe. She made sure that he was cared for, that the son knew that his mother loved him. But we see here that she was able, as she worshiped and she prayed, as she believed God, she was able to pass that on to her son. We don't have an inherited religion, but we do have a religion in which the parents can teach the children the Lord's way. Hannah's a great example of that. She prepared herself to be a godly mother, just like Lois and Eunice prepared Timothy for the work that God had for him. Well, what else might you notice about the life of Hannah? She understood the value of a child. Do you see how she's wept, how she's been so anxious? She wants a child so desperately. She understood the value. You know, we live in a time in which, as you think about that, the life of a child is not always valued very highly. There's people who will take the life of a child and they will destroy it. Hannah understood how valuable having a baby would be. God's going to give her that son. And after that, we read that when she gave him back to the Lord, she had other children that came as a blessing into her life. She understood the value of a child. Look at some of the scriptures there. We read there in verses 7 and 8. We already read verse 7. It was year by year when she went up to the house of the Lord that she provoked her. Peninnah provoked Hannah. Therefore she wept and did not eat. Then Elkanah said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? Why do you not eat? Why is your heart grieved? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? Here's a lesson, fellas. What not to say. Your wife's all upset. She's all torn up inside. She's really in anguish over this. And you say, what? Am I not good enough for you? You don't want the answer to that question. I don't read that Hannah answered him, but am I not better to you than 10 sons? I'm afraid if Hannah would have answered honestly, she'd have said, no, I want a child. I want a baby. I want a son. She saw the value and she understood how valuable that was in her life, that she could raise up, she could influence, she could help this little boy that she would have, Samuel, to be a servant of God. When we read there in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 15 and 16, this is when Hannah it's thought that she's drunk because she's praying so emotionally, and Eli can't hear her, but he sees her mouth moving. It says, and Hannah answered and said, no, my Lord, I am a woman of sorrowful spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor intoxicating drink, but have poured out my soul before the Lord. Do not consider your maidservant a wicked woman, for out of the abundance of my complaint and grief I have spoken until now. When she was not having a child, how desperately did it impact her? Sorrowful spirit, the abundance of her complaint and grief, to the point that Eli didn't know what to think as he sees her crying out to God. The psalmist says this, behold, children are a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are the children of one's youth. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. He shall not be put to shame when he speaks with his enemies in the gate. Here's something that every parent ought to know. If you don't know it, wrap your mind around it. Get it in your understanding. Hannah understood. Children are a blessing. To have children in your life and for God to entrust them in your hands, that's overwhelming for me sometimes. To know the mistakes I make, the wrong decisions, the way in which I try to direct my children and fail sometimes. God's entrusted something so valuable. Not only a human life, but an eternal soul that I can help to know the right way. You ought to see the value there. And parents, you'll make mistakes, you'll stumble, you'll do the wrong things, but do the best you can, because you need to know the value of a child. You need to know the value of one that you can mold and shape and help to be what God wants them to be. What else about Hannah? Hannah had the right priorities. What do you think of when you want, what do you want for your child? I want them to be a doctor. Or to marry a rich doctor. Not a witch doctor. A rich doctor. I want them to have everything their heart desires. You know, that's not what Hannah wanted for Samuel. But she had her priorities right. She had her priorities right in what she really wanted for him and how she wanted to raise up this child. When we read there in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verses 11 and 12, she made a vow, it says, and she said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me, and do not forget your maidservant, but I will give your maidservant a male child. Then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life. And she talks about that Nazirite vow. No razor shall come upon his head. And it happened as she continued praying before the Lord that Eli watched her mouth. That's when he didn't know what she was saying. Lord, you give me a child. And guess what? I'll give him to you. You know, that's a Bible pattern. The Lord gives us our life, and we give our life to the Lord. The Lord gives us possessions, and we give back to the Lord's work. and toward others who may have needs. The Lord gives us a child. Hannah says, you give me a child, and I'm going to give him to you. And he might not be Babe Ruth or Wayne Gretzky or a famous doctor or lawyer, but I'm going to do everything I can, everything in my power, to make that child that you've given me a servant of yours. Maybe today, I'll put you on the spot for just a minute, like Hannah. Maybe today you're here because your mom wanted you to be here. You might think that I'm going to beat you up about that, and I'm not. I'm going to say, good for your mom. Good for your mom. That she had that kind of influence. That her priorities were right. That you can buy her a flower, or you can buy her lots of flowers, or candy, or a present. Or I saw on online that some mother got a new car. Don't get carried away, because that's not happening at our house. Some mother got a new car. But you know what? A godly mother like Hannah wants, more than anything like that her children are faithful. And her children can have the hope of eternal life. And after this life is over and they pass, that they can be in heaven. That's what a godly mother wants. Hannah says, you give me a child, I'll give him back to you. You know, sometimes people make promises to God. Sometimes people don't keep their promises. We see there about Hannah. She says, for this child I prayed. Have you ever prayed for a child? Have you ever really, really wanted a child? For this child I prayed. And the Lord has granted me my petition which I asked of him. Therefore, I also have lent him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he shall be lent to the Lord. So they worship the Lord there. Sometimes people get really emotional and really stirred up like Hannah was, and they make a vow to God, they make a promise to God, but we say, well, God doesn't expect me to keep that. I made that in an emotional state. Yeah, God does. Whether you make that promise or not, God expects you to give that child back to him. He says, you give me a child, I prayed for it, I asked for it, and I said this is what I do, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make sure that child's a servant of yours. I'm going to give him back, and he's going to serve in the Old Testament in the temple of God. I would like for us to look there in 1 Samuel chapter 2, and I'd like to look at how Hannah responds to this child that's come into her life. You might think, well, I'm going to have to send him up there with Eli. He's going to have to serve in the temple of God. I'm going to miss him an awful lot. I'm going to see him once a year when I take that little robe to him. But look at what Hannah says. Beginning in 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 1, it's Hannah prayed to God there, and she said, my heart rejoices in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. I smile at my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. No one is holy like the Lord, for there is none besides you, nor is there any rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let no arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is the God of knowledge, and by him actions are weighed. The bows of the mighty men are broken, and those who stumbled are girded with strength. Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, and the hungry have ceased to hunger. And the barren has borne 7, and she who has many children has become feeble. The Lord kills and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and brings up. The Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and lifts up. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the beggar from the ash heap, to set them among the princes and to make them inherit the throne of glory. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and he has set the world upon them. He will guard the feet of the saints, But the wicked shall be silent in darkness, for by strength no man shall prevail. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken in pieces. From heaven he will thunder against them. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. You know what she's saying? God rules. All these things that have happened, they're at God's hand. And so, with what God has done with me, I'm going to serve Him. With this child, I'm going to serve Him. Do you have a child that your life has been blessed with? Do you have children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren that have blessed your life? The greatest priority you can have is for them to, number one, be a Christian, and then to be faithful all their days. And know that the work of that is God placing that in your hands. She had the right priority. We read there that Samuel ministered before the Lord even as a child, wearing a linen ephod. He was a priest before God as a child. 1 Samuel 2 and verse 18. For us, we'd look at Proverbs 22:6. Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. She had that in mind. One more. Hannah, a godly mother, she prepared her life to be that kind of mom. She understood what having a child in her life meant, and she understood the responsibility of it in having the right priorities. Even if she didn't care if she was lost, she's going to make sure that son of hers, that he served God. That Samuel was a servant of God. You know, she provided for her child. You know what I mentioned earlier there in 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 19. Moreover, his mother, that's Hannah, she used to make him a little robe and bring it to him year by year. Why did she do that year by year? Well, after he was weaned, he was taken there to Eli, and so when he was 6, why would he need a new robe when he was 7? You know, no matter what you do, those kids keep growing. Grow a little taller, a little bigger. And while she sent him off to serve in that way, and that's hard for us to fathom what that was like, she didn't forget her son. She provided for him. She made him a little robe. Each year, when they came up, she saw her son. When they came up to offer that yearly sacrifice, she brought him a new robe. And he would know that his mother cared and his mother provided. When we think about the woman of Proverbs 31, she has that characteristic about her. It says, she also rises while it's night. This is the virtuous wife. She rises while it's night. She provides food for her household and a portion for her maidservants. You're saying a virtuous wife makes sure her kids have food? It says she is not afraid of snow for her household, for all her household is clothed with scarlet. She makes sure her kids have clothes. In verses 27 and 28, it says, she watches over the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. She watches over their ways. She wants to make sure her children are doing right. She provides food and clothing, and she helps them to do the right things in life. She provides that instruction. Hannah did that. The virtuous woman in Proverbs 31 did that. I think Hannah is a great example of a godly mother. I can look around this auditorium and I can see women that I believe are godly mothers and grandmothers and have done many of these things. They prepared themselves to be godly mothers. They understood how valuable it was when God placed in their hands a child. They've had the right priorities, and they have tried to train up their children in all the right ways. Ultimately, it's the child's decision what they follow, but they have set those priorities in the home. And they've provided and watched after the food and the clothing, the shelter, the training of their children. There's lessons there for every mother and every woman who desires someday to be a mother. And if you have one like that, you ought to rise up and call her blessed. When I think about the priority that Hannah had there, she wanted that child to be a servant. I'll tell you that God, your Heavenly Father, He wants you to be a servant of His. And if you've never obeyed the gospel, why wouldn't you repent and be baptized this very day so that you can be a child of God? If you're a child of God who's unfaithful, why wouldn't you come home? You know, there's one thing Hannah realized. She realized what was really important. I'm going to call upon you to search your heart and your mind and think about what's really important. If we can help you, we'll do that right now as we stand and sing.